Supreme Court allows some Trump vote-by-mail limits ahead of midterm election. The unsigned order lets the administration start planning parts of its mail ballot policy while lawsuits continue in lower courts. It lifted an injunction that had covered 23 states and Washington, D.C., according to the package's court coverage. Courthouse News, Reuters, CNBC, NPR, and the Los Angeles Times all describe the ruling as interim rather than a final merits decision. The immediate effect is practical. Election officials now have to decide whether preparation, guidance, and voter notices should change before the midterm calendar tightens. The dissent from the three liberal justices signals that the legal dispute over federal power and voting access is still active. States that oppose the policy can keep pressing statutory and constitutional claims in the trial courts. Voters should not assume every local rule changes at once, because administration guidance and state litigation will determine what actually lands at county offices. The next concrete signals are revised election agency instructions, new state filings, and any lower court order narrowing or extending the injunction. That timing matters because ballots, envelopes, signatures, drop boxes, and postmark rules require advanced printing, training, vendor contracts, and voter education before litigation can finish. And county clerks need clear enforceable deadlines before ballots are mailed to voters statewide. Trump hits back at Carney, threatens to hike auto, truck, metals tariffs to 50%. Reuters says the threat covers cars and trucks from Canada, while NBC News, Al Jazeera, France 24, and CNN place it inside a widening trade fight. The reported number matters because a 50% tariff would hit supply chains that cross the US-Canada border multiple times before a finished vehicle reaches a dealer. Automakers, parts suppliers, trucking firms, steel buyers, and aluminum users would all have to price the risk before any formal customs order appears. Canada's response matters too, because retaliation could move the fight from campaign language into invoices, factory schedules, and consumer prices. The policy is not yet the same as a collected tax at the border. Companies will watch whether the White House issues customs guidance, whether courts intervene, and whether negotiators carve out exemptions for autos, trucks, metals, or parts. Market reaction may show up first in automaker shares, supplier warnings, and currency moves. The next concrete signals are written tariff notices, Canadian countermeasures, and formal talks between trade officials. That sequence matters because companies cannot plan prices, inventory, or labor around a speech alone. They need enforceable tariff codes, exemption language, and start dates before suppliers decide whether contracts need emergency price clauses. Trump administration plans to revoke visas of foreigners seeking asylum. Reuters, Al Jazeera, The Guardian, The New York Times, and Axios all describe a plan focused on large numbers of people who entered with temporary visitor visas and later applied for protection. Al Jazeera, The Guardian, and Axios cite a figure of up to 200,000 visas, making the scale central to the story. The legal consequence is separate from the headline. Losing a visa can affect lawful status, work authorization, travel, and future immigration proceedings even while an asylum claim remains pending. The administration would still have to translate the plan into notices, agency guidance, and case-by-case actions that can be challenged. Immigration lawyers and affected families will watch whether the policy names B1 and B2 visitor categories, whether it applies retroactively, and how appeals are handled. Courts may be asked to decide whether blanket revocations conflict with asylum protections or administrative process rules. The practical stakes are housing, employment, family separation, and docket pressure in an already strained immigration system. The next concrete signals are Homeland Security instructions, State Department visa notices, and first lawsuits from affected applicants. That distinction matters because immigration agencies can create immediate uncertainty through paperwork even before an asylum judge decides whether someone qualifies for protection, for applicants already waiting in crowded court dockets. Nevada sues Trump administration over its Colorado River plan. Reuters, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, NPR Las Vegas, and The Guardian describe a lawsuit challenging federal handling of Colorado River cuts and revival planning. The dispute matters because Nevada, Arizona, California, tribes, farms, cities, and power users share a river system already stressed by drought and long-term overuse. Nevada is arguing in court because administrative water decisions can determine which communities absorb shortages and which conservation commitments count. The case is not just a desert policy fight. It affects Las Vegas planning, agricultural deliveries, hydropower assumptions, and negotiations over post-river rules. A judge could slow a federal plan, require more process, or leave agencies room to proceed while broader negotiations continue. Other basin states will read the complaint for clues about whether their own allocations or conservation credits are exposed. The Interior Department's response will show whether it defends the plan as emergency management or opens a new bargaining track. The next concrete signals are the federal answer, any request for an injunction, and revised basin-state proposals. That process matters because water users negotiate under deadline pressure, and a pending injunction can change leverage before the next river management calendar closes, for cities signing budgets tied to future water deliveries and power assumptions. Gold rally gains momentum ahead of U.S. inflation data, Jackson Hole event. Reuters says bullion advanced as investors awaited U.S. inflation figures and the Federal Reserve's Jackson Hole gathering, while CNBC and Asian business outlets described prices near a three-month high. Gold often moves when traders reassess real interest rates, the dollar, and expectations for central bank policy. That is why the next inflation print matters. Hotter price data can support higher yields and pressure non-yielding bullion, while softer data can strengthen the case for easier policy. Jackson Hole matters because Fed officials often use the event to frame risks before autumn meetings. The rally also reflects demand for hedges if investors worry about deficits, currency weakness, or geopolitical shocks. It does not mean every consumer price is rising, and it is not a direct forecast of a recession. The market test is whether buying survives new CPI details, Treasury yield moves, and the Fed chair's speech. Watch miners, exchange-traded funds, futures positioning, and the dollar for confirmation. The next concrete signals are inflation components, rate cut probabilities, and Jackson Hole guidance. Reuters, CNBC, The Business Times, and The Economic Times give investors a source trail to compare spot prices, Treasury yields, dollar strength, and Fed messaging, while bullion traders weigh risk hedges against yield competition and currency pressure. New York supermarkets sue over Mamdani's municipal grocery stores. The Hill, CNN, The New York Times, The New York Post, and Fox Business report that local grocers and business owners are challenging a city-run grocery plan associated with Zoran Mamdani. The lawsuit matters because it turns a campaign-style affordability proposal into a legal and budget fight over whether government-backed stores would compete unfairly with private bodegas and supermarkets. Plaintiffs argue that city sponsorship could distort rents, pricing, procurement, and neighborhood competition. Supporters are likely to frame municipal groceries as a response to food deserts, high prices, and uneven access to fresh food. The immediate question is not whether shoppers get cheaper groceries tomorrow. It is whether a court lets the city keep designing the program, whether officials publish financing details, and whether business groups can show concrete harm before stores open. The case also forces clarity on locations, suppliers, labor costs, and operating subsidies. New York consumers should watch for filings that explain how prices would be set. The next concrete signals are the city's legal response, budget documents, and any injunction hearing. That legal posture matters because a temporary injunction could pause city planning before voters, grocers, landlords, and budget officials learn the program's real cost, before opening plans become leases, payrolls, and contracts. Tropical Storm Moke, Hawaii Emergency Management Agency. Hawaii emergency officials issued guidance as Moke approached, and CBS News reported maps showing the storm path while Hawaii braced for as much as 15 inches of rain. Local outlets carried warnings urging residents to stay home and remain vigilant. The public safety issue is flooding, landslides, road closures, power outages, dangerous surf, and heavy rain that can overwhelm streams and drainage quickly across steep terrain, especially when people try to drive through water or wait too long to prepare supplies. The state agency notice matters because emergency managers coordinate shelters, county alerts, school decisions, and rescue resources. Forecast tracks can shift, so residents need county-level guidance rather than a single statewide. Travelers should watch airport and road advisories before moving between islands or across low-lying routes. The next few updates will show whether rainfall totals, flash flood watches, or evacuation zones expand. A calm-looking break in weather does not end the risk if saturated ground and runoff continue. The next concrete signals are national weather service bulletins, county emergency alerts, shelter lists, and damage assessments. CBS News, KOLN, Hawaii News Now, and the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency all point viewers toward forecast maps, county notices, and stay-home guidance, as island residents prepare routes, supplies, and shelter decisions. Bessent threatens new Iran secondary sanctions, says Trump is asking world leaders to cooperate. Reuters reports that the United States threatened countries doing business with Iran while holding off on penalties for now. And NBC News, CNBC, The Guardian, and France 24 describe a broader pressure campaign. The phrase secondary sanctions is important because it means Washington is warning foreign companies, banks, and governments that transactions with Iran could expose them to U.S. penalties. That can affect oil shipments, shipping insurance, banking access, and trade decisions beyond the United States. The policy also tests cooperation from China, Europe, and regional governments that may resist blanket economic pressure. Holding off on immediate penalties leaves room for diplomacy, but it also creates uncertainty for firms that need compliance guidance before contracts renew. Iran's response could be political, legal, or regional, and energy markets may react if traders see supply risk. The stakes are economic pressure, alliance coordination, and the possibility of escalation if sanctions enforcement collides with other governments' interests. The next concrete signals are Treasury designations, compliance advisories, allied statements, and Tehran's public response. That uncertainty matters because foreign banks may freeze activity before penalties arrive, while governments decide whether cooperation with Washington is worth the domestic cost, while oil buyers and insurers judge exposure to penalties. Israeli airstrikes in Gaza killed 2 people, including 4-year-old boy, medics say. Reuters reports the deaths, while the Times of Israel, the Journal, Al Monitor, and other regional coverage cite additional accounts of children killed or injured in strikes. The exact toll varies across reports, which is why attribution to medics and local authorities matters. The core issue is civilian harm in a conflict where military statements, hospital accounts, and independent verification often arrive on different timelines. Each new strike can affect ceasefire diplomacy, humanitarian access, and pressure on Israeli decision-makers. It can also influence regional reactions if deaths of children become a focal point in public statements or negotiations. Viewers should separate confirmed casualty counts from claims about responsibility until more records are available, while the next official military explanation may describe a target or say whether a review is underway. Aid groups may report whether crossings, hospitals, or evacuation routes are affected. The practical stakes are family losses, medical capacity, and whether mediators can prevent a wider round of attacks. The next concrete signals are Israel Defense Forces statements, hospital updates, and mediator or aid agency briefings. That verification matters because casualty reports, target claims, and humanitarian access updates can shift quickly, while families and mediators make decisions under pressure, before diplomats can assess whether de-escalation is possible. Putin wants to draft 300,000 new troops, Zelenskiy says. Reuters reports Zelenskiy's claim, while The Hill, The New York Post, The Telegraph, and Ukrinform describe warnings about a possible new mobilization after elections. The number is significant because 300,000 additional personnel would suggest Russia is preparing for sustained operations rather than a short battlefield adjustment. It would also test recruitment systems, training capacity, equipment stocks, and domestic tolerance for another large call-up. The claim comes from Ukraine's president, so viewers should treat it as a high-stakes assertion that needs corroboration from Russian orders, local notices, or intelligence assessments. If Moscow moves ahead, effects could show up in regional draft offices, transport flows, and battlefield rotations before officials give a full public explanation. For Ukraine and its allies, the planning question is whether air defense, ammunition, and manpower support need to assume a longer war. Diplomatically, the allegation adds pressure before any ceasefire or negotiation track can restart. The next concrete signals are Russian mobilization decrees, regional recruitment notices, allied intelligence briefings, and Ukrainian battlefield updates. That planning matters because a mobilization order would shape Ukraine's defenses, Western ammunition requests, Russian regional politics, and any negotiation calendar for months, before either side can price the human and military cost in autumn campaign planning.